By the time the police lights washed over the marble entrance of the Grand Lakeshore Club, Byron Fletcher had already shown his driver's license, his insurance card, the registration, the digital title record, and the key fob in his hand. None of it mattered. The Rolls-Royce was parked 2 steps behind him, its black paint reflecting the lake, the white columns and the faces of people pretending not to stare. A woman in pearls stood near the valet stand with one arm folded across her chest and the other hand holding her phone as if it were a weapon. She had already told the dispatcher that a suspicious man was attempting to steal a member's vehicle. She had already made sure her voice was loud enough for half the entrance to hear. And when Byron quietly told her the car was his, she did not laugh because she thought he was joking. She laughed because she thought he needed to be reminded of his place. Her name was Patricia Davenport, and at Grand Lake Shore people lowered their voices when she walked by. She was not the owner, although she often moved through the building as if the foundation had been poured for her family alone. She had been a member for almost 20 years, then became senior director of member relations after her husband secured a management position inside the club's hospitality network. She knew the seating chart for every gala. She knew which widows still donated quietly. She knew which new members could be ignored for 3 weeks and which ones required handwritten notes on thick cream paper. And on that warm Thursday afternoon, she looked at Byron Fletcher, a calm black man standing beside a car worth more than most houses, and decided the only explanation she could accept was theft. The strange part was not that she was wrong. The strange part was how many chances she had to stop being wrong. Byron had not come to Grand Lake Shore looking for attention. That was almost the defining feature of his life. He had built a fortune learning how to notice rooms without needing rooms to notice him back. His company, Fletcher Meridian Group, owned logistics firms, commercial real estate, hotels, restaurants, and 3 private hospitality properties that most members believed were still controlled by old family trusts. He rarely appeared at ribbon cuttings. He hated speeches that made money sound like character. He preferred contracts, quiet audits, and the kind of patient work that fixed a business before anyone outside knew it had been broken. He had grown up in East Cleveland with a mother who kept church envelopes in a metal recipe box, and a father who could diagnose an engine problem by listening to the first uneven turn of the key. His father had never owned anything close to a Rolls-Royce, but he had taught Byron that a car, any car, carried the dignity of the hands that paid for it, cleaned it, and kept it moving. On Saturday mornings, young Byron stood in the open bay of his father's garage, sweeping dust into the alley, while men in expensive suits tossed keys without looking at him. His father never let him toss them back. He would place each set of keys on the counter lined up straight and tell Byron that other people's manners were not instructions. That sentence stayed with him. It stayed with him when he was the only black student in an advanced finance seminar where classmates assumed he was there on a sports scholarship he had never had. It stayed with him when a bank officer asked whether his first acquisition proposal had been written by someone else. It stayed with him when investors praised his numbers but looked past him in the lobby, searching for the man they had expected to meet. By the time he had real money, the kind that made people laugh harder at jokes and remember your birthday, Byron had learned a discipline that looked almost unnatural from the outside. He did not rush to correct every insult. He watched. He listened. He made a record. Grand Lake Shore had entered his life 9 months before the incident, not as a dream, but as a problem. The club sat on 40 acres of lakefront property with a golf course, a boathouse, tennis courts, formal gardens, a private dining room, and a membership list that read like a map of local power. Judges had eaten there. Mayors had begged for invitations. Families who had lost their factories still kept memberships because leaving the club would feel like admitting history had moved on without them. But behind the brass plaques and polished floors, the business was weaker than it looked. Maintenance costs were rising. Younger members were leaving. Lawsuits had been settled quietly. Vendors were overcharging. Membership practices were vague enough to hide almost anything. And every time Fletcher Meridian's due diligence team asked for records, the answers arrived late, incomplete, or wrapped in the kind of polite language that usually meant someone was hoping no one would ask twice. So Byron bought the holding company. He did it cleanly, through a chain of entities and board approvals that left the club's daily staff mostly untouched until the review was finished. That was his habit. He believed a business showed its true condition before people knew the owner was in the room. If a restaurant treated a dishwasher badly only when no executive was watching, the problem was not the dishwasher. If a private club welcomed certain guests with champagne and others with suspicion, the problem was not the guest list. The problem was culture, and culture was never hidden from the people forced to survive it. For weeks, Byron received reports from auditors, accountants, and outside counsel. There were complaints from former applicants who had been told the waiting list was closed, even though friends of current members were admitted the same month. There were staff notes about racial jokes in the locker room that managers had dismissed as tradition. There were handwritten records showing that certain members could break rules without consequences, while employees who objected were given fewer shifts. And at the center of many of those reports, appearing again and again, in careful language, was Patricia Davenport. Patricia did not leave fingerprints in obvious places. She preferred small humiliations that could be explained away if challenged. A family arriving for a charity luncheon would be told their table had been moved to a back room because of a private booking that did not exist. A young black attorney applying for membership would be asked for additional references, then additional financial verification, then informed that the committee wanted to take more time. A server who corrected her would find himself assigned to patio duty during the coldest evenings of the month. Her prejudice had manners. That made it easier for the club to protect. Byron had planned a visit without announcement, walk the property, speak with a few department heads, and attend a private dinner with the interim board under the name B. Fletcher. It was not meant to be dramatic. He had no interest in entering through the front doors with a photographer behind him. He wore a charcoal jacket without a tie, dark slacks, and a watch plain enough that only a serious collector would recognize it. The Rolls-Royce was the one indulgence he had allowed himself after a difficult year, not because he needed strangers to see it, but because his father had once kept a magazine photo of that model taped inside a toolbox. When Byron bought the car, he drove it first to his father's old garage, now leased to a tire shop, and sat there for 10 minutes with the engine off. He did not cry. That was not his way. He just touched the steering wheel and remembered the sound of his father's broom against concrete. At Grand Lake Shore, the afternoon was bright and windless. The lake beyond the terrace looked almost staged, too blue and too still, as if the club had paid someone to keep it from looking ordinary. 2 valets stood near the entrance in white shirts and green vests. A bellman rolled luggage toward a guest cottage. Members drifted from lunch to the parking court with the relaxed entitlement of people who had never wondered whether they belonged where they stood. Byron parked near the valet stand because he had been instructed to meet the general manager there before touring the grounds. He stepped out, checked a message from his lawyer, and paused beside the car to review the names of the senior staff he would be meeting later. He was not hiding. He was not touching someone else's door handle. He was not looking around nervously. He was standing beside his own vehicle, holding his own keys, reading a note on his phone. That was when Patricia noticed him. She had just left a membership committee lunch where 2 board spouses had complained about changes coming from the new corporate owners. They disliked the phrase new corporate owners. It sounded too modern, too accountable, too much like the club might become a business instead of an inheritance. Patricia had assured them that she knew how to handle transition periods. She had said the club had standards. She had said it with the soft confidence of a person used to having uglier thoughts translated into acceptable language. Then she walked outside and saw Byron. At first, she did not approach him. She watched from the top of the steps, her eyes moving from his face to the Rolls-Royce, from the Rolls-Royce to his shoes, from his shoes back to his face. Something in the picture did not fit the story she carried in her mind. If he had been in uniform, she would have had a category for him. If he had been holding a tray or wearing a delivery badge or walking 2 steps behind a white member, she might have passed without a second glance. But he was standing still with a car beside him like it belonged there. That was enough to disturb her. She came down the steps with the crisp little smile she used when correcting staff in front of guests. Byron looked up as she approached. He expected a greeting. He did not expect warmth exactly. He had read too many reports for that, but he expected a question shaped like hospitality. Instead, Patricia asked him what he was doing with that vehicle. Byron answered evenly that he was waiting for someone. Patricia's eyes went to the key fob in his hand. She asked whether the owner had given him permission to stand there. She did not ask who he was. She did not ask whether he was a member guest vendor or visitor. She began at suspicion and built from there. Byron told her the car was his. The valet nearest them, a young man named Russell Avery, turned his head slightly. Russell had been working at Grand Lake Shore for 11 months, long enough to know when a situation was becoming dangerous, and short enough still to believe that telling the truth ought to help. He had checked the arrivals list that morning. He had seen the name B. Fletcher attached to a corporate appointment. He had also watched Byron step out of the Rolls-Royce himself. There was nothing confusing about it. But Russell also knew Patricia. He knew the sound of her voice when she wanted obedience without witnesses. He knew that if a server made her look foolish, the schedule changed. Hours disappeared. Tips went to someone else. Russell's mother had medical bills stacked in a plastic folder at home, and his younger sister was starting community college in the fall. He needed the job in the unromantic way people need jobs when there is no backup plan waiting politely in another room. So at first, Russell only watched. Byron took his registration from the glove compartment when Patricia demanded proof. He did it slowly, not because he owed her the performance, but because he already understood what the moment could become. He had seen enough situations turn on a sudden movement. He had seen calm men described as aggressive because their hands moved too quickly toward a pocket. He knew the old arithmetic of fear. The less threatening he became, the more threatening some people would claim he was. He placed the documents on the hood of his car so both of them could see. The registration listed his name. The insurance matched. The address matched his license. He opened the vehicle app and showed that the car was registered to his account. Any ordinary misunderstanding should have died there quietly and with a little embarrassment. Patricia did not let it die. She glanced at the documents as if paper itself could be insolent. Then she suggested the documents could be faked. She asked why he would be waiting outside instead of entering through the proper door. She said members did not usually loiter near cars. Her voice had sharpened by then, and 2 women near the planters slowed down to listen. A golfer removing his shoes beside a cart stopped with 1 foot on the pavement. The entrance, which had been all gentle conversation and rolling luggage a few minutes earlier, began to tighten around them. Byron asked Patricia for her name and position. That question irritated her more than any answer he had given. People like Patricia were comfortable demanding information. They were less comfortable becoming information. She told him her name with the cool authority of someone expecting recognition, then added that she was Senior Director of Member Relations. Byron nodded once as if he were filing it somewhere. He was. Patricia mistook his calm for weakness. That was her first serious mistake. She told him the club had a responsibility to protect its members' property. She said there had been incidents in the area, though she could not name one involving a stolen Rolls-Royce from the club entrance in broad daylight. She moved from questions to accusations with the confidence of someone who had rarely paid for being careless. When Byron repeated that the car belonged to him and that he was expected at a meeting, Patricia's face changed. The polite mask thinned. Something harder looked through. She said in a voice low enough to pretend discretion and loud enough to wound that people like him did not get to walk onto private property and invent stories. The words did not surprise Byron. That was the part that hurt most. Not the insult itself, not even the ugliness behind it, but the tired familiarity of it. He had heard versions of that sentence in nicer rooms, with better grammar. He had heard it from bankers' receptionists, neighbors, security guards, and donors who claimed later they had only been cautious. Every generation invented new language for the same old locked door. Byron did not raise his voice. He asked Patricia if she was refusing to accept the documentation in front of her. She took that as defiance. Her phone was already in her hand. She called the police while standing beside him, describing him as a suspicious black male near a luxury vehicle, then as a man attempting to steal it, then as confrontational when he challenged her account. Byron could hear enough of the call to understand the shape of the lie. He looked at Russell then, not pleading, not demanding, just looking. Russell looked away for half a second, then back. That half second mattered. It was the little space where fear and conscience argued. The first patrol car arrived in less than 8 minutes. Officer Daniel Nolan stepped out with one hand resting near his belt and the other already lifted in a gesture that told Byron to stay where he was. Nolan had worked off-duty security at club events before. He knew Patricia by name. He had taken coffee from the service kitchen during charity auctions. He had stood near the ballroom doors while men in tuxedos gave speeches about civic responsibility. When Patricia hurried toward him, he accepted her version before Byron had opened his mouth. That was the second serious mistake. Nolan asked Byron to step away from the vehicle. Byron did. Nolan asked for identification. Byron provided it. Nolan asked who owned the car. Byron answered again. The documents were still on the hood, held in place by the weight of a leather folio. Nolan barely glanced at them. He asked how Byron had come into possession of the keys. Byron held them up and explained that he had driven there himself. Patricia interrupted repeatedly, each time adding a little more danger to the story. Now Byron had been seen pulling at the door. Now he had become aggressive when questioned. Now she was concerned for the safety of members arriving for afternoon tea. Each statement laid another board over the truth, and Nolan did not remove any of them. He nodded. He took notes. He looked at Byron with the guarded impatience of an officer who had decided this was not a misunderstanding, but a suspect wasting his time. Byron asked him to run the registration properly. Nolan told him not to tell him how to do his job. The sentence changed the air. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Everyone near the entrance understood what it meant. It meant Byron's evidence would be treated as attitude. It meant facts would have to ask permission before entering the conversation. It meant the officer had stepped into Patricia's story and had no intention of walking out of it easily. Russell moved closer to the valet podium. There was a tablet mounted there, showing arrivals, reservations, vehicle notes, and valet status. He could see the entry clearly. B. Fletcher, corporate appointment, 3 p.m., executive arrival. Under vehicle notes, entered by the concierge after Byron's assistant called that morning, was the make, model, color, and plate of the Rolls-Royce. Russell's mouth went dry as he read it. The proof was right there, glowing on a screen 10 feet from the officer. He knew what would happen if he said nothing. He also knew what might happen if he spoke. Patricia was telling Nolan that Byron had no reason to be on club grounds. Byron was standing with his hands visible, his jacket open, his posture controlled. A few members had begun recording, not openly at first, phones angled downward, then lifted slightly. That was how modern courage often began, not with someone stepping forward, but with a camera pretending to check a message. Russell picked up the tablet. He approached carefully, addressing Officer Nolan with the stiff politeness service workers learn when speaking to authority that can ruin their week. He explained that the vehicle matched the arrival record. He explained that Byron had driven in and had not touched anyone else's property. He offered to show the entry. His voice was not strong at first, but it held. Patricia turned on him so quickly that his shoulders tightened. She reminded him that he was not part of the conversation. She said staff should not interfere in security matters. The words were clean enough for the crowd, but Russell understood the threat underneath them. His shifts, his tips, his mother's prescriptions, his sister's tuition deposit. All of it stood behind Patricia like invisible leverage. Still, he kept the tablet raised. Nolan looked at it for less than 2 seconds. Then he told Russell to step back. That was the third serious mistake, because by then the situation was no longer about a mistaken accusation. It had become a record of refusal. Refusal to read documents. Refusal to check an arrival log. Refusal to listen to a witness. Refusal to let a black man standing beside his own car be treated as a person with facts instead of a problem to control. Byron noticed all of it. He noticed Patricia's left hand trembling slightly, not from fear of him, but from the thrill and pressure of being publicly obeyed. He noticed Nolan turning his body toward Patricia whenever he needed reassurance that the story was still the one he had chosen. He noticed the general manager had not appeared, even though the entrance camera would have alerted security. He noticed Russell standing with the tablet lowered now, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the pavement, as if he were trying not to look humiliated by his own workplace. Byron had spent his career deciding when to speak and when to let people finish revealing themselves. He decided this was not finished. Nolan told Byron he was being detained while they investigated the attempted theft. He asked Byron to place his hands on the hood of the car. A murmur moved through the small crowd. Someone whispered that this was excessive. Someone else said Patricia must know something. Another member, a man in a linen jacket who had once served on the club's admissions committee, stepped closer, as if he might help, then stopped when Patricia glanced his way. The club had trained people well. Even their discomfort knew how to behave. Byron placed his hands on the hood. The paint was warm from the sun. For a moment he saw his reflection in the black surface between his fingers. He looked calm because he had practiced calm for most of his life. But calm was not the same as comfort. His pulse had moved into his wrists. His throat had tightened, not from guilt, not from confusion, but from the old physical knowledge that truth does not always protect you in time. That is the part people who have never been treated this way often fail to understand. They imagine justice as a door that opens when you show the right key. They imagine proof as a shield. They imagine that if you speak clearly, comply politely, provide documents, and keep your hands visible, the system will correct itself, because that is what systems are supposed to do. But Byron knew proof could sit on the hood of a car while an officer looked past it. He knew a key could be in your hand and still not unlock belief. Nolan patted him down. Patricia watched. That image would later become the first still frame shared across social media. Byron Fletcher, hands on his own Rolls-Royce, while the woman who accused him stood behind the officer with her chin lifted. The photo alone could not show the registration on the hood. It could not show the arrival log on Russell's tablet. It could not show the years of complaints buried in board packets and HR files. But it showed enough. A man being treated as a criminal beside property he owned. A woman being believed because disbelief would inconvenience the world she belonged to. Nolan found nothing. He stepped back, but he did not apologize. Instead, He asked Byron where he worked. That question almost made Byron smile, not because it was funny, but because it revealed the size of the assumption underneath the whole encounter. The officer had Byron's license. He had the registration. He had the car. He had a witness. He had an arrival log. But still, some part of him needed a job title to decide whether the man in front of him deserved ordinary respect. Byron answered that he worked in investments. Patricia made a small sound through her nose. It was not quite laughter. It was worse, because it tried to be private while making sure Byron heard it. She told Nolan that anyone could say that. She added that the club had been dealing with people coming onto the property pretending to have business. There was no evidence of such a pattern, but accusations do not need evidence when they are feeding a fear the listener already recognizes. Byron asked whether he was free to leave. Nolan said no. Byron asked what probable cause justified holding him after he had presented ownership documents and a witness had corroborated him. Nolan's jaw set. He told Byron that the investigation would proceed at his pace. The sentence sounded official, but it was really pride wearing a badge. Nolan had been challenged in front of a wealthy club employee, several members, and a young valet. To admit the mistake now would mean admitting he had made it after evidence had been offered. Many injustices grow larger at exactly that point, not because the truth is unclear, but because someone powerful would rather deepen the harm than suffer embarrassment. Byron looked toward the lake. The water beyond the club was still shining. A child laughed somewhere near the tennis courts. A silver tray clinked inside the open doors. Life around the entrance continued in little fragments, as if nothing important were happening, as if a man's dignity could be interrupted without interrupting afternoon service. Then Byron asked to make a phone call. Nolan hesitated, but there were too many cameras now. He allowed it while standing close enough to hear the first words. Byron called Elaine Whitcomb, his personal attorney and general counsel for Fletcher Meridian Group. He did not raise his voice. He did not describe Patricia in ugly terms. He gave the location, the officer's name, Patricia's name, the status of the vehicle, documents the presence of witnesses, and the fact that he was being detained despite proof of ownership. Elaine listened without interrupting. Then she asked one question. Byron answered yes. The officer's body camera appeared to be on. After that, he ended the call. Patricia had been watching his face, searching for a crack. She did not see one, so she supplied one for the audience. She told Nolan that Byron was now calling someone to help him fabricate a story. She said people like him were always ready with excuses. By then she had stopped hiding the edge in her voice. The club entrance had given her a stage, and the stage had made her careless. Russell heard it. So did half the crowd. One of the older members, a retired judge named Marjorie Bell, lowered her sunglasses and stared at Patricia with a look that should have warned her. Patricia did not notice. She was too busy enjoying the authority she believed she had borrowed from the uniform beside her. Nolan asked Byron to sit on the low stone wall near the valet stand while they waited for additional verification. Byron did not sit. He said he would remain standing unless he was under arrest. The distinction mattered. Nolan's face tightened again. For 3 seconds, the whole scene balanced on a thin wire. Patricia wanted an arrest. You could see it in the way she leaned forward, not much, but enough. She wanted the satisfaction of being proven right by force. Nolan did not arrest Byron. He did something smaller and almost as revealing. He took Byron's keys and placed them on top of the patrol car, beyond Byron's reach. The crowd went quiet. There is a particular humiliation in watching your own property placed under someone else's control, while people who know better stand by and let it happen. Byron looked at the keys. The black leather fob caught the light. His father's old voice moved through his memory again, the one about other people's manners. But another memory came with it, this time his father standing in the garage after a customer called him boy, wiping his hands on a rag, telling young Byron that dignity did not mean letting people steal the truth from your mouth. So Byron spoke, not loudly, not dramatically. He asked Russell by name whether the arrival record still showed his appointment. Russell looked up startled that Byron remembered his name tag. Patricia snapped that Byron should not speak to staff. Nolan warned him to stop involving employees, but the question had already landed. Russell swallowed once and said the record was still there. He said the plate number matched. He said he had seen Byron exit the car. This time, his voice carried. Patricia's face flushed. She told Nolan that Russell had been confused and that staff at his level did not always understand member security. It was a cruel sentence because of how ordinary it sounded. At his level. That was the club's entire sickness in 3 words. Some people existed at levels where they were believed. Others existed at levels where truth had to climb stairs before anyone would let it in the room. Byron turned his head slightly toward Russell, not enough to make a display of gratitude, but enough to make sure the young man knew he had been seen. That mattered too. Elaine Whitcomb arrived in 23 minutes. She did not arrive alone. Behind her came a second attorney from a local civil rights firm, a compliance director from Fletcher Meridian, and the interim chief financial officer of the holding company that owned Grand Lake Shore. Their black sedan stopped behind the patrol car, and Elaine stepped out with a leather case in one hand and a calm expression that made several members instinctively move back. Patricia noticed the quality of Elaine's suit before she noticed the danger. That was typical of her. She read surfaces quickly and souls poorly. Elaine greeted Byron first. She asked whether he was injured. He said no. She asked whether he had been free to leave. He said no. She asked whether his keys had been taken. He glanced toward the patrol car. Elaine followed his eyes, then turned to Officer Nolan and asked with careful politeness whether the keys had been seized as evidence in an arrest held during an investigative detention or taken for some other stated legal purpose. Nolan did not answer immediately. That pause was the first time Patricia looked uncertain. Elaine then asked whether Nolan had reviewed the registration, insurance, arrival log, witness statement, and digital ownership record before taking the keys. Nolan said he was still investigating. Elaine asked whether he had run the plate. He said dispatch was checking. The compliance director quietly held up his phone where the plate had already been verified through the company's security system. Elaine did not look at Patricia yet. She knew better than to chase the loudest person in the scene before securing the record. Then Patricia stepped forward. She introduced herself with the full weight of her title, Senior Director of Member Relations, as if Elaine had arrived to receive instructions. She explained that the club had standards. She explained that Byron had been evasive. She explained that the police had been called for everyone's safety. Each sentence was shaped to sound responsible. Each sentence depended on ignoring the documents in front of her. Elaine listened until Patricia finished. Then she asked one quiet question. Had Patricia personally accused Byron Fletcher of attempting to steal his own vehicle? Patricia's expression changed at the sound of his full name. Not because she recognized it, not yet, but because Elaine said it with the precision of a person placing a signature on a contract. Patricia said she had reported suspicious activity. Elaine asked whether she had used the word theft. Patricia began to soften the word, but Russell, still standing by the valet podium, said the dispatcher had been told the car was being stolen. A member near the planter added that she had recorded part of the call. Retired Judge Bell said she had heard it as well. The room outside the club, if an entrance could become a room, shifted. Patricia sensed the shift and tried to regain control. She said this was ridiculous. She said she could not be expected to know every person who wandered onto club property. She said Byron had failed to identify himself properly. Byron had not moved. He watched her build the last pieces of her own trap. Elaine opened her leather case and removed a slim folder. She handed one page to Officer Nolan, one to Patricia, and one to the interim CFO. The page was not long. It did not need to be. At the top was the corporate structure of Grand Lakeshore Hospitality Holdings. Beneath it were the ownership percentages. Beneath those was the controlling entity, and beneath that, in clean black type, was the name that made the entire entrance go still. Byron Fletcher, principal owner, controlling shareholder, final approving authority over executive employment club governance and membership reform. For several seconds, no one spoke. The lake wind moved lightly through the flags above the entrance. Somewhere inside, silverware touched china. The world did not crack open. There was no thunder, no music, no perfect cinematic justice arriving with a roar. There was only paper silence and the sudden collapse of a story Patricia had told with absolute confidence. She looked at Byron then, as if seeing him for the first time, not as a man, not yet, as power. That was the saddest proof of all. His humanity had been available from the beginning. His documents had been available. His calm had been available. Russell's witness had been available. The arrival log had been available. None of those things had reached her, but ownership did. Authority did. The knowledge that his signature could end her career finally did what his personhood could not. Byron stepped away from the car. Elaine retrieved his keys from the patrol car without asking Patricia for permission. No one did not stop her. He had become very interested in his radio. Patricia started to speak, then stopped, then started again with a softer voice. She said there had been a misunderstanding. She said she was trying to protect the club. She said anyone in her position would have done the same. Byron looked at her for a long moment. Then he said that no one in her position would remain there. He did not shout. That almost made it heavier. A shout can be dismissed as anger. His voice carried the steadiness of a decision made after evidence had been gathered. He asked the interim CFO to suspend Patricia Davenport immediately, pending termination for cause, remove her access credentials, preserve all communications related to the incident, and begin a wider review of every membership complaint, employee grievance, vendor relationship, and disciplinary action connected to her office. Patricia's mouth opened. For the first time that afternoon, words did not arrive in the order she wanted. She said he could not do that in public. Byron answered that she had chosen public. She said she had years of service. Byron answered that years of service were not years of ownership over other people's dignity. She said she had protected the club's reputation. Byron looked around at the cameras, the officer, the valet, the members, frozen beside their handbags and golf shoes, and he told her the reputation had finally become visible. That line traveled farther than anything else he said. One of the videos caught it clearly. By then, Warren Davenport had come outside. Patricia's husband was director of facilities procurement for the regional hospitality group, though most members simply knew him as the man who always found a reason to sit near board donors at dinner. He had been in a back office when someone texted him that Patricia was in trouble at the entrance. He arrived with his tie loosened and his face arranged into managerial concern. At first, Warren tried to speak to Byron as if they were colleagues. Then the CFO handed him the same ownership page. His confidence drained differently from Patricia's. Hers had cracked with disbelief. His sank with calculation. He understood corporate structures. He understood what controlling shareholder meant. More importantly, he understood what a review of vendor relationships might find. Byron noticed that too. He asked Warren to surrender his access card before leaving the premises. Warren protested that he had not been involved in the incident. Elaine answered that the incident had triggered a broader compliance audit already scheduled before Byron's visit, and that his department's records were being preserved. It was a careful sentence. It told him nothing and everything. Warren looked toward Patricia then, and the look was not love or loyalty. It was resentment. She had pulled a thread in public, and now the whole garment was coming loose. Officer Nolan tried to step back from the center of the scene, but the body camera was still on. Elaine turned to him and asked for his badge number again, this time for the civil rights complaint. Nolan said there had been confusion. He said he had relied on a complainant who appeared credible. Elaine asked whether he considered Byron's documents credible. Nolan did not answer. She asked whether he considered Russell's witness statement credible. Nolan said staff witnesses could be mistaken. Russell's face tightened, but he did not look down this time. The second attorney wrote every word. That was the moment Nolan seemed to realize the story would not end in the parking court. It would move from body camera to supervisor review, from supervisor review to internal affairs, from internal affairs to the public record. His earlier choices had felt small when Patricia's confidence surrounded him. Now, each one had weight. The ignored registration, the dismissed arrival log, the taken keys, the refusal to let Byron leave, the way he had accepted the word of a club official and discounted the word of the man with the documents. Nolan returned Byron's license with a hand that was not quite steady. Byron took it without comment. That restraint would bother Nolan later more than any insult could have. Anger gives people something to defend against. Byron gave him facts. The incident might have ended there, contained in disciplinary files and legal letters, if Patricia had left quietly. But people who mistake control for respect often cannot recognize the moment when silence would save them. As security escorted her toward the side entrance, she turned back and said Byron had set her up. She said he had come there looking for a reason to ruin people who had built the club. She said everything was changing because people like him wanted to take over spaces that were never meant for them. No one had to interpret that sentence. It interpreted itself. Phones lifted higher. Russell's tablet was still in his hand. Retired Judge Bell was no longer hiding her recording. The golfer in the linen jacket had stopped pretending he was not involved. A younger member near the valet stand posted the first clip before Patricia reached the staff corridor. Within an hour, the video had spread through private group chats. By evening, it was on local news. By midnight, national accounts had clipped the moment when Patricia accused Byron, the moment Russell tried to show the arrival log, and the moment Elaine's document revealed who owned the club. The internet gave the story a title before Byron did. Some called it the Rolls-Royce incident. Others called it Grand Lake Shore's mask-off moment. But the clip that traveled fastest began with Patricia's voice calling Byron suspicious, and ended with her learning that the man she tried to remove could remove her. It was satisfying in the quick way viral justice often is. People shared it because the reversal was clean. The powerful woman fell. The calm man won. The young worker was proved right. The officer looked foolish. The rich club was exposed under its own white columns. But Byron did not experience it as entertainment. That night he sat in his kitchen long after the calls stopped coming. His phone kept lighting up on the counter. Messages from friends, messages from executives, messages from people he had not heard from in years. Some were angry on his behalf. Some were impressed by his restraint. A few tried to make jokes about owning the room. Byron did not answer most of them. He kept thinking about what would have happened if he had not been Byron Fletcher, if he had been Russell's uncle borrowing a nice car, if he had been a driver waiting for a client, if he had been a teacher attending a scholarship luncheon, if he had been a black man without a lawyer who answered on the second ring, without corporate documents, without an ownership structure powerful enough to make Patricia hear his name differently. The thought did not make him feel victorious. It made the room feel cold. The next morning, Fletcher Meridian released a statement that was shorter than reporters wanted and stronger than the club expected. It confirmed Patricia Davenport's termination for cause, Warren Davenport's suspension pending investigation, an independent review of Grand Lake Shore's membership and employment practices, full cooperation with law enforcement, oversight, and immediate protection for employees who had witnessed or reported misconduct. It also confirmed that Russell Avery would not face retaliation and had been placed on paid leave for the weekend, not as punishment, but because no employee should have to return the next morning and serve coffee to people who had watched him risk his job. That detail mattered. Byron insisted on it. Public outrage came quickly, but outrage is not reform. Byron knew that better than most. Outrage burns hot, then looks for another room. Reform has to stay after everyone stops filming. So he refused 3 television interviews and spent the next week inside conference rooms with lawyers, auditors, staff representatives, and community leaders who had been excluded from Grand Lake Shore for decades. The review found what people close to the club had known for years. Membership applications had been handled through an informal sponsor system that gave old families veto power without writing the veto down. Applicants from certain neighborhoods were asked for more documentation than applicants with the right last names. Employees who complained about racist comments were described in personnel notes as difficult, emotional, or not aligned with club culture. Vendor contracts connected to Warren Davenport had been renewed at inflated rates, while minority-owned businesses were told there were no openings. Security protocols were vague enough that staff could call police on a guest without documenting why. The club had not been broken by one woman's bad afternoon. The afternoon had revealed the machinery. Patricia tried to control the damage at first. Through an attorney, she claimed she had acted out of genuine concern. She said the viral clips lacked context. She said Byron had been uncooperative, that Russell had misunderstood the records, that the club entrance was confusing, that anyone could have made the same mistake. But the evidence did not bend toward her. The dispatch call contained words she later denied using. The body camera showed Byron presenting documents again and again. The valet tablet showed the arrival record. Witness videos captured her statements clearly enough that even people who wanted to defend her began using softer phrases like unfortunate and poorly handled. Then prosecutors filed charges for making a false report. That changed the tone. The same people who had whispered that Patricia was being sacrificed for politics stopped whispering when the affidavit became public. It laid out the timeline in plain language. At 2:48 p.m., Byron arrived. At 2:52 p.m., Patricia confronted him. At 2:55 p.m., he presented documentation. At 2:57 p.m., Russell verified the arrival record. At 3 p.m., Patricia called police and reported an attempted theft. At 3:08 p.m., Officer Nolan arrived. At 3:14 p.m., Byron was detained despite corroborating evidence. At 3:37 p.m., counsel arrived and established ownership of both vehicle and property. There was something brutal about the timestamps. They left no room for the fantasy that everything happened too fast to think. Patricia had time. Nolan had time. The club had time. The truth stood there with documents in its hand waiting to be acknowledged. In the civil case that followed, Patricia settled for $350,000. Byron did not need the money in the way most plaintiffs would have needed it, and that fact became part of the public conversation. Some people asked why a millionaire should collect damages at all. Byron answered only once in a written statement prepared after the settlement. He said damages were not a price tag on his embarrassment. They were a public acknowledgement that false accusations create real danger and that people with status should not be allowed to weaponize police without cost, simply because the target happened to survive the encounter. The money went into a legal defense and scholarship fund for service workers, first-generation students, and local residents facing discriminatory treatment in private institutions. Byron named Russell as one of the fund's first advisory members. Russell almost declined. He had not slept well since the video went viral. People recognized him at the grocery store. Strangers sent him messages calling him brave. A few former club members called him disloyal. His mother kept replaying the clip and touching his shoulder afterward as if checking that he was still there. He was proud of what he had done, but pride did not erase the shaking that came afterward. Courage can look clean in a video and still leave a person tired in places applause cannot reach. Byron understood that. When they met privately 2 weeks after the incident, Byron did not begin by offering him a promotion. He asked Russell how he was sleeping. He asked whether the club had ever retaliated against him before. He asked what employees said when managers were not present. Russell, who had prepared polite answers, found himself telling the truth instead. He talked about split shifts that made no sense. He talked about members who called grown men boys and managers who pretended not to hear. He talked about how staff learned which guests to warn one another about. He talked about Patricia's habit of smiling with her mouth while punishing people through schedules. He talked about the tiny humiliations that never made it into lawsuits because everyone needed rent. Byron listened without typing. At the end, he told Russell that what he had done at the valet stand was not small. He had not saved Byron's car. Byron's car was insured, documented, and surrounded by cameras. What Russell had protected was reality. He had refused to let a lie become official simply because it was spoken by someone with a higher title. Russell looked down at his hands. They were clean, but he kept rubbing one thumb across the other, the way people do when trying to steady themselves without being noticed. Byron offered him a new role, not as a reward tossed down from above, but as work that matched what he had already shown. Russell became Assistant Director of Guest Integrity and Employee Advocacy, a title that sounded unusual because Grand Lake Shore had never needed to name such a thing before. His job was to help redesign front-of-house protocols, protect staff reporting channels, and make sure guest disputes could not be buried by hierarchy. He received training, a salary that made his mother cry quietly at the kitchen table, and authority that came with direct access to the Independent Ethics Office. Some members complained that the club had become political. Byron considered that one of the least serious complaints he had ever heard. Grand Lake Shore had always been political. It had simply called its politics tradition when the power moved in one direction. The old sponsorship system had been political. The unwritten rules about who looked like a member had been political. The decision to believe Patricia over documents had been political. Reform only felt political to the people who had mistaken comfort for neutrality. Within 90 days, the club's membership process changed. The anonymous veto system ended. Application criteria were published. Complaints could be filed through an independent channel outside club management. Security calls required documented facts, not feelings dressed up as danger. Staff received the right to submit incident reports without supervisor approval. Vendor bidding reopened under external review. The club created community memberships, scholarship partnerships, and public access days for the Lakefront Youth Sailing Program that had once been open mostly to children whose families could afford private lessons. The changes did not turn Grand Lake Shore into paradise. No honest reform works that fast. Some members resigned dramatically, writing letters about standards while never naming the standard they believed had been lost. Others stayed and learned to behave differently when behavior finally had consequences. A few apologized to staff they had ignored for years. Some apologies were awkward. Some were late. Some were more about being seen apologizing than about repair. But a few were real, and Russell learned to recognize those by what happened after the words. Real apology changed schedules, tips, eye contact, and who cleaned up after meetings. Byron visited often in the months that followed, but rarely in the Rolls-Royce, not because he was ashamed of it, because the car had become a symbol other people wanted to use, and Byron had no interest in living inside a symbol all day. He arrived sometimes in a plain sedan, sometimes with no announcement, sometimes walking the grounds with Russell and a notebook. He asked housekeepers which supply closets flooded during heavy rain. He asked kitchen staff whether meal breaks were real or only written into policy. He asked applicants what the process felt like from the outside. He asked members who had never been questioned at the door whether they understood the difference between welcome and permission. Some did, some did not. One afternoon, months after the incident, Byron stood near the same valet stand where Nolan had taken his keys. The stone wall had been cleaned. The security camera had been repositioned. The tablet system had been updated so arrival records could not be dismissed without a supervisor note. A small plaque had been installed inside the employee entrance, not in the marble lobby where members could admire themselves for allowing it, but where staff would see it before stepping into the day. It read, "The truth does not depend on title." Russell had chosen the sentence. Byron had approved it. On that afternoon, a new family arrived for a tour. The parents looked nervous, in the way people look when they have dressed carefully for a place that has historically enjoyed making outsiders feel overdressed and underprepared at the same time. Their daughter, maybe 12, stood beside them, holding a folder against her chest. She was there for the sailing scholarship orientation. The old Grand Lake shore would have made them wait near the side desk until someone important decided whether to notice them. Russell saw them first. He stepped forward, greeted them by name, and walked them through the front entrance. No announcement, no performance, just the front door opening, because it should have opened. Byron watched from near the valet stand. For a second he saw two moments layered over each other. Patricia standing in the sun with a phone in her hand, and this young girl walking past the same columns with her folder held tight. One image did not erase the other. That was important. Repair did not mean pretending the harm had never happened. Repair meant changing what would happen next time, then proving it again and again until the new habit became stronger than the old one. Officer Nolan's case took longer. Police departments move at a speed that often feels designed to exhaust the people waiting for accountability. The first statement from the department said Nolan had followed protocol during a complex property dispute. Then the body camera footage was reviewed. Then dispatch audio was compared with witness video. Then supervisors had to explain why an officer had ignored matching documents and an independent witness while extending a detention based largely on the statements of a complainant whose account kept changing. The union defended him. That surprised no one. But the footage did what footage sometimes does when people cannot explain it away fast enough. It forced language to become more honest. Complex property dispute became failure to properly assess evidence. Followed protocol became violations of detention policy. Confusion became bias-influenced judgment. After public hearings and internal review, Nolan was terminated. His file noted improper detention, failure to investigate exculpatory evidence, and conduct that damaged public trust. Byron did not celebrate. He had no appetite for pretending one firing repaired the wider truth. Nolan had not invented the reflex that made Patricia credible and Byron suspicious. He had participated in it. He had enforced it. He deserved consequences for that. But if the lesson ended with one officer losing his job, everyone else could go home believing the problem had been safely placed inside one man. Byron refused that comfort. Through the new fund, he helped finance legal clinics focused on false reports, discriminatory trespass claims, and unequal treatment in private security settings. The clinics were not glamorous. They met in libraries, community centers, church basements, and school auditoriums with buzzing lights. People came with folders, phone videos, receipts, email threads, and stories they had been told were too small to matter. A teenager accused of stealing from a boutique while holding a receipt. A nurse followed through a luxury apartment lobby while visiting a patient. A contractor removed from a property he had been hired to repair because a neighbor did not believe he belonged there. Byron attended the first clinic quietly and sat in the back. He listened as lawyers explained what to document, when to request body camera footage, how to file complaints, how to preserve video, and how to protect yourself without escalating danger. None of it felt triumphant. It felt necessary. That is a different kind of hope, less shiny and more durable. Afterward, an older man approached Byron and said he had watched the Grand Lake Shore video. He said he was glad Byron had owned the club. Then he paused, shook his head, and added that he wished Byron had not needed to. That sentence stayed with him more than the headlines, because that was the wound at the center of the whole story. People liked the reversal because it felt fair. A woman tried to humiliate a man, then discovered he had more power than she did. A bad actor faced consequences. A good witness was promoted. A club changed its rules. There was satisfaction in that, and satisfaction matters. Communities that have watched injustice repeat itself need to see wrongdoers lose sometimes. They need to see the lie fail in public. But the deeper question remained. What happens when the person beside the car is not a millionaire? What happens when there is no Elaine Whitcomb driving over with corporate documents? What happens when there is no controlling shareholder page, no viral video, no retired judge near the planter, no Russell brave enough to lift the tablet, no audience willing to admit what it saw? What happens when the man has the registration but not the status that makes people read it? That question made the story bigger than Byron. It also made him more careful with his victory. He did not want to become a character people used to reassure themselves that justice works. Justice had worked for him because he had resources, witnesses, restraint, and a structure of power hidden behind him. He wanted the next person to need fewer miracles. So he kept pushing the club, the police department, the city, and his own company towards systems that did not require the victim to be exceptional before the truth could breathe. At Grand Lake Shore, the first annual employee forum was held in the ballroom where Patricia had once controlled seating charts like they were royal decrees. This time, housekeepers sat beside department heads. Valets sat beside board members. Kitchen staff spoke before donors. Translators were provided without anyone having to beg. Anonymous questions appeared on a screen behind the podium, and some of them were uncomfortable enough that the room shifted in its chairs. Byron opened the forum with only a few words. He said the club had mistaken quiet for harmony. He said it had mistaken exclusivity for excellence. He said it had mistaken the absence of complaints for the absence of harm. Then he sat down. The rest of the meeting belonged to the people, who had been expected to carry trays, park cars, scrub floors, manage tempers, and disappear before dessert. Russell spoke near the end. He did not tell the story as if he were a hero. He told it as a worker who had almost stayed silent. He admitted that when Patricia first confronted Byron, he had looked away because he was afraid of losing hours. The room was very still when he said that. It is not easy to admit the moment before courage. But that was why people believed him. He did not polish himself into something nobler than human. He said the club had taught staff to survive by staying out of the way, and that if the new leadership wanted honesty, it would have to make honesty less expensive. Byron wrote that sentence down. Honesty, less expensive. It became the guiding principle for the next round of reforms. Staff who reported discrimination were guaranteed schedule protection while complaints were investigated. Members who retaliated against employees faced suspension. Managers were evaluated on complaint handling, not just dining revenue and event satisfaction. Security decisions had to pass a simple test. What fact, not fear, justified the action? The test was printed on cards and placed behind every service desk. What fact, not fear? It was not poetry. It was better than poetry. It was usable. Patricia's life after the case did not collapse in the theatrical way strangers online sometimes wanted. She did not vanish into poverty. She did not become a lesson walking around in permanent disgrace. She sold the lake house. She lost her position. She paid the settlement. Her social circle split into those who defended her in private, those who condemned her in public, and those who stopped returning calls because scandal is contagious in communities built on appearances. She attended court in understated clothes and looked smaller without the club behind her. But smaller did not mean innocent. At sentencing for the false report charge, Patricia's attorney described her charitable work, her years of service, her lack of prior convictions, and the pressure she had felt managing a changing institution. Byron listened from the second row. He did not object to those facts. People are rarely only the worst thing they have done. Patricia had chaired fundraisers. She had sent flowers to sick members. She had remembered birthdays. She had also used her authority to place a man in danger because she could not imagine him as the owner of his own car. Both truths could sit in the room. Only one explained the crime. When given a chance to address the court, Byron did not ask for cruelty. He asked for clarity. He said Patricia had not made a harmless mistake. She had been corrected and chose escalation. She had seen documents and chose suspicion. She had heard a witness and chose status. She had used the police as an instrument of her own prejudice, and for people without resources, that kind of choice could end in handcuffs, injury, or worse. His statement was brief. The judge ordered probation, community service, payment of the civil settlement already agreed to, and a formal apology that Patricia struggled to read without sounding like she was still negotiating with reality. Byron accepted none of it as complete repair. He accepted it as a record. Warren Davenport's audit ended with quieter consequences but deeper embarrassment. Inflated vendor contracts were terminated. Payments were traced. Conflicts of interest were documented. He resigned before the board could vote on his removal, then tried to frame the resignation as a desire to spend more time with family. The local business paper published enough of the audit findings that the phrase, "spend more time with family," did not protect him. Several vendors repaid fees. 2 contracts were awarded to firms that had previously been told the club was not considering new bids. One of those firms was owned by a woman whose father had once been denied membership at Grand Lake Shore in the 1980s. She did not mention that when she signed the contract. She just did the work well. That quiet competence pleased Byron more than any headline. Months passed. The viral storm moved on. New scandals replaced old ones. People who had posted angrily about Grand Lake Shore began arguing about something else. That is the way public attention behaves. It arrives like weather and leaves before the ground has fully dried. But inside the club, the work continued in less dramatic forms. A complaint was filed, investigated, and resolved without retaliation. A member was suspended for insulting a server. A scholarship student who once would have been treated as a guest of charity became captain of the youth sailing team. A maintenance worker reported a safety hazard and was thanked instead of blamed. The front desk stopped asking certain visitors whether they were lost. None of those moments went viral. That was partly how Byron knew they mattered. 1 year after the incident, Grand Lake Shore held a community open house on a Sunday afternoon. Not a gala, not a press event, an ordinary open house with food stations, sailing demonstrations, lawn games, job fair tables, legal clinic sign-ups, and guided tours of a place that had once perfected the art of making people wonder whether they were allowed to stand too close to the entrance. Byron almost did not attend. He disliked anniversaries of pain turned into public relations. But Russell convinced him. He said people needed to see the space being used differently. Not talked about differently, used differently. So Byron came. He drove the Rolls-Royce. For a moment when he pulled into the parking court, conversation thinned. People recognized the car before they recognized him. It was impossible not to remember the video. The same columns stood there. The same lake shone beyond the terrace. The same stone wall sat near the valet stand. But the feeling of the place had changed in ways small enough to be trusted. The staff were not stiff. The families walking in were not being watched like possible mistakes. Russell stood at the entrance in a navy suit, greeting visitors with the ease of someone who had earned authority without letting it harden him. Byron stepped out and handed him the keys. For both of them, the gesture carried more weight than anyone nearby could fully understand. Russell looked at the fob in his palm, then at Byron. A year earlier, those keys had been taken by an officer who refused to see proof. Now, Byron placed them willingly in the hand of the young man whose truth had helped pull the lie apart. No speech could have said it better. Russell parked the car himself, not because he had to, because he wanted to finish the circle with his own hands. Inside, the open house was louder than Grand Lake Shore had ever allowed itself to be. Children ran over carpets that once seemed designed to hush footsteps. An old member taught two teenagers how to read the wind before launching a small boat. A kitchen supervisor handed out plates beside a pastor who had spent years criticizing the club's exclusion. Retired Judge Bell sat near the window, speaking with Russell's mother, who had come wearing a blue dress and a cautious expression that softened only after the third person told her how proud she must be. Byron moved through the room without entourage. Some people thanked him, some apologized, some wanted pictures. He accepted what he could and avoided becoming the center when the day belonged to something larger than one man's vindication. Near the back hallway, he stopped at the employee entrance and looked again at the plaque Russell had chosen. The truth does not depend on title. The words had held up. Later, as the sun began to lower over the lake, Byron found Russell outside near the valet stand. The crowd had thinned. The open house was ending in the slow, scattered way good days often end, with children refusing to leave and adults gathering bags from under chairs. The Rolls-Royce waited near the curb, polished, but no longer carrying the same ache. Russell handed Byron the keys. This time, no one watched with suspicion. That did not mean the world had been fixed. It meant one corner of it had been forced to tell the truth, and then forced to build procedures that remembered the truth after the cameras left. Byron looked at the car, then at the entrance, then at the people still walking out through doors that had opened too narrowly for too long. He thought of his father lining keys on a counter. He thought of Patricia's phone. He thought of Nolan's hand taking what was not his. He thought of Russell's voice shaking, then strengthening over a glowing tablet at the edge of the valet stand. Character is not revealed by how politely someone treats the powerful. That is easy. That is strategy. That is survival in expensive clothing. Character is revealed in the moment when a person believes there will be no consequence for cruelty. It is revealed in how they speak to the worker who cannot answer back, the stranger whose name they do not recognize, the applicant without sponsors, the guest without visible status, the person standing beside something beautiful that the world has decided they could not possibly own. Patricia Davenport failed in that moment. Officer Nolan failed after being given chance after chance to correct course. Russell Avery, afraid and underpaid and fully aware of what truth might cost him, passed. And Byron Fletcher, with every reason to turn the whole episode into revenge, chose something harder. He chose record, consequence, repair, and memory. He chose to make the next lie more difficult to tell. He chose to make honesty less expensive for the person with the least protection in the room. That is why the story lasted longer than the video. Not because a millionaire owned a Rolls-Royce, not because a cruel woman was embarrassed in public, but because for one afternoon at Grand Lake Shore, the old rules revealed themselves clearly enough that no one could pretend they were invisible anymore. A car, a key fob, a valet tablet, a police report, a corporate document, and a young worker's trembling voice all became part of the same truth. And the truth, once fully seen, did not go back into the shadows. Byron drove away near sunset, the lake turning gold in the rearview mirror. He did not feel triumphant exactly. Triumph was too simple a word for what remained. What he felt was quieter, heavier, and more useful. He felt the responsibility of having been believed only after power entered the frame. and he felt the obligation to spend that power, making belief less dependent on wealth the next time. At the old garage in East Cleveland, the tire shop was closing when he arrived. He parked outside for a few minutes, engine idling softly, hands resting on the same wheel his father would have admired with a mechanic's eye before pretending not to be impressed. The building looked smaller than memory, as most childhood places do. The bay door was dented. The alley pavement had cracked. A broom leaned near the wall. Byron sat there until the last light left the glass. Then he turned off the engine, stepped out, and placed the keys in his palm for a moment before putting them in his pocket. They were just keys. They were also proof, burden, memory, and promise. The next morning, Grand Lake Shore opened its doors under new rules. Russell arrived early. The front desk staff reviewed the day's appointments. A family from the east side came for a scholarship interview. A retired member brought flowers for the kitchen staff after a fundraiser. A new security supervisor asked a question from the card behind the desk before making a call. What fact, not fear? It was a small sentence. But small sentences, when people actually live by them, can change the way a door opens.